James Carter thought he was living the dream in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but the day a letter from his HOA demanded $70,000, that dream shattered into a nightmare. Claire, his wife, watched their sense of safety unravel. As threats escalated, liens were placed, and neighbors turned suspiciously silent. What seemed like a clerical mistake was exposed by their teenage daughter Emily, who stumbled across hidden records that revealed a scheme to strip families of their homes. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was running a calculated operation to profit from fear, and James's property was the ultimate prize. The first sign of trouble came quietly, in the form of a white envelope resting in the mailbox, the kind that looked no different from a routine bill or community notice. It was the kind of thing most people might glance at, toss on the kitchen counter, and forget about until later. But this envelope carried more weight than its paper frame suggested. Inside was a letter from the Homeowners Association, one that claimed something outrageous, that over $70,000 in fees had gone unpaid. The number was so staggering that at first glance it seemed like a printing error, the kind of clerical slip that could be straightened out with a quick phone call. Yet the longer the words were read and reread, the less it seemed like a mistake. It wasn't just a bill, it was a threat. Stamped at the bottom was the chilling notice that if the amount wasn't paid, foreclosure proceedings could begin. The house, the very roof overhead, could be taken. Shock rolled in like a tide, but denial quickly followed. How could a family, who had paid dues on time, who had records of every payment, suddenly owe such an astronomical sum? A mind instantly tries to rationalize. Maybe a misfiled payment, maybe a miscommunication, maybe an error in the system. That night, every drawer that held receipts and bank statements was pulled open, every file reviewed for missing checks or forgotten notices. The records were clear, everything was paid. There was no gap, no missing line item, no skipped dues that could possibly add up to what was being claimed. Yet the letter had been written with confidence, stamped with official language, and designed to create fear. The home no longer felt safe in the hours after that discovery. What had always been a sanctuary now seemed fragile, as though the walls themselves could be claimed by someone else's pen. The neighborhood outside continued its usual rhythm, the sound of sprinklers sputtering to life, children pedaling bikes along the sidewalks, cars pulling into driveways after long days of work, but the air inside was heavy. There was an invisible clock ticking, a sense that time was running out to understand what was happening. The words of the letter repeated in the mind, like a warning bell. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the suggestion that one family was already losing. In the days that followed, the envelope became an object of dread, placed on the table but never far from view, as though ignoring it could make the words vanish. The mind kept circling back to the number $70,000. It was not just large, it was designed to be crushing. A figure no ordinary household could absorb without ruin. Why such a number? Why not something smaller, something that could be quietly settled? The magnitude itself felt like a statement, a deliberate attempt to overwhelm and force surrender. The fear began to whisper possibilities. What if this was only the beginning? What if it wasn't a mistake, but the first step in something larger? What was once a comfortable suburban setting began to feel staged. The houses too neat, the lawns too perfectly trimmed. The realization dawned that behind the tidy facades might lie mechanisms meant to control rather than protect. If a simple letter could threaten everything built over years of work and sacrifice, then perhaps the entire foundation of neighborhood order was less solid than it appeared. Nights grew longer with worry, as sleep gave way to a restless cycle of doubt, fear, and suspicion. The home still stood, but its security was already cracked by nothing more than words on paper. What was supposed to be a mistake now felt like the opening move in a game that had already been rigged. The letters did not stop. What began as a single demand grew into a steady stream, each envelope thicker than the last, stuffed with photocopied documents and stern warnings stamped in red. The language was always cold and precise, the kind that left no room for interpretation. The charges were labeled special assessments, a vague phrase that carried weight but no clarity. No description of what the money was for, no explanation of projects completed, no evidence of work done, just page after page of numbers climbing higher and deadlines drawing closer. The neighborhood that once felt like a haven of order and structure began to feel like a carefully constructed illusion, a place where rules existed only to benefit those writing them. On the cul-de-sacs and along the sidewalks, life carried on as though nothing was amiss. Neighbors waved while walking their dogs, lawns stayed freshly trimmed, and porch lights flicked on at the same hour every evening. Yet beneath the calm surface, there was a different kind of movement, one that was hard to miss once it was noticed. People spoke in lowered voices near mailboxes, conversations cut short when others passed by, and there were murmurs about secret HOA board meetings held late at night. These gatherings were not the open forums promised in the community guidelines. They were private sessions, locked behind closed doors, where decisions about money and enforcement were made without the knowledge of those paying the fees. Whispers of strange expenses began circulating. Some mentioned a new landscaping contract, but no one had seen trucks or workers. Others spoke of road repairs that were supposedly approved, though every street in the subdivision looked untouched. The signs of corruption were not obvious at first, but the more people looked, the more the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Receipts were rumored to exist for maintenance jobs that had never been performed. Votes were allegedly taken on costly improvements, yet no ballots had been sent to homeowners. The board members, once viewed as neighbors volunteering their time, now seemed more like a hidden council acting on motives that had little to do with community well-being. Each new letter only deepened the sense of isolation. While some residents admitted they too had been hit with strange fees, smaller amounts that were painful but manageable, most seemed resigned to paying them rather than risking escalation. It became clear that silence was part of the design. The board counted on people staying quiet, on neighbors being too timid to question authority. But the $70,000 demand was not just another bill. It was an outrageous figure, one that seemed carefully chosen to push a single homeowner past the breaking point, to turn a financial squeeze into full-blown foreclosure. The idea was chilling. It suggested that the association wasn't just enforcing rules, but actively seeking ways to strip people of their homes. The feeling of being singled out was heavy, like a spotlight aimed directly at one front door while the rest of the neighborhood stayed dimly lit. There was no clear way to fight back. Phone calls went unanswered, emails bounced back with generic replies, and office doors were locked during the hours they claimed to be open. Every attempt to reach someone who could explain the charges ended in silence. It was as though the board had built walls as impenetrable as the fences they regulated so strictly. The neighborhood itself began to feel hostile, even in its perfect stillness. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk carried a different weight, and the casual glance of a neighbor from across the street raised questions of loyalty and complicity. Were others in on it? Was this part of a pattern that had been going on for years, hidden in plain sight by the neatness of the lawns and the sameness of the houses? The sense of community that once made the neighborhood desirable now felt staged, a performance masking something darker. Each day brought the same routine: another envelope, another demand, another page filled with vague but threatening words. The house remained the same on the outside, but the atmosphere inside was suffocating, filled with the constant fear that the home itself was already slipping away. What had started as an ordinary notice in the mail was evolving into something much larger, a quiet conspiracy spreading through the cracks of suburban life. The realization was unavoidable. The neighborhood was not united but divided, and the board that was supposed to serve the community was slowly turning it into a stage for exploitation. The threats grew sharper with time, shifting from vague warnings to legal action stamped with the authority of the courthouse. One morning, a document arrived that was unmistakably different from the others. The heavy paper bore the seal of the county, declaring that a lien had been placed on the property. The house, the single place meant to be untouchable, now had a shadow tied to it in the form of debt that was never real. The number $70,000 no longer existed only on HOA stationery. It was now written into public record, given the power of law, and capable of stripping away ownership. What had once seemed like a mistake had hardened into something official. The weight of the lien was not just financial. It carried a psychological toll that spread into every corner of daily life. Simple routines became infected with dread. Walking past the "for sale" signs scattered across the neighborhood, one couldn't help but wonder how many had gone up voluntarily, and how many had been forced by the same methods. The cheerful wave of a passing neighbor suddenly looked different, as though behind the smile was the knowledge of what the HOA had already done to others. It became clear that this was not an isolated incident. The board had perfected its tactics in smaller doses, targeting families with smaller sums, knowing most would pay to make the problem vanish. Now, with one household singled out for a staggering amount, it felt like a test. Would the resistance break, or would others begin to see through the facade? Lawyers entered the picture, their letters arriving with the same precision as the HOA's notices. The language was colder, sharper, full of references to statutes and consequences. Words like foreclosure and seizure appeared with frightening regularity, eroding the sense of stability inside the home. The thought of losing everything, not just the house, but the years of work that had gone into it, loomed like a storm cloud that never moved away. The neighborhood itself began to feel less like a community and more like a trap, designed to keep residents compliant while slowly bleeding them of resources. Isolation deepened as the struggle intensified. Those who had once chatted casually across fences or lingered by mailboxes now seemed to avoid eye contact. Whether out of fear or complicity, they chose silence. There was talk, faint but noticeable, that others had quietly settled their disputes, with the HOA handing over thousands of dollars just to make the pressure stop. This only confirmed the suspicion that the $70,000 demand was never about debt. It was a show of power, a signal sent to the entire neighborhood that resistance would be crushed. To take one property by force would send a message, louder than any letter. Inside the house, stacks of papers grew taller with each passing week. Legal documents, HOA letters, and notes from rushed consultations with attorneys filled counters and desks. Every day brought the same grim routine of reviewing numbers and searching for loopholes, only to find doors closed at every turn. The walls of the home, once a source of comfort, seemed to close in with the knowledge that ownership could be stripped away by nothing more than manipulated records. Even sleep offered no escape, As the mind played out scenarios of sheriffs arriving at the door, locks being changed, and belongings dragged out into the street. It became harder to believe that this was simply about money. The sum demanded was too carefully chosen, the escalation too calculated. This was not an error spiraling out of control, but a strategy. The HOA appeared less like a group of neighbors managing a community, and more like an entity designed to extract as much as possible from those who lived under its rules. The lien was not the end but the beginning. HOA meant to break resistance and pave the way for a forced sale. The house was being targeted, not for unpaid dues, but for the value it represented. The realization settled like a stone. This was a battle not against paperwork, but against a system engineered to win. The homeowner was not just fighting to keep a roof overhead, but was standing in the path of something larger, something that thrived on silence and compliance. The lien was both a weapon and a warning. To give in would mean surrendering everything, but to fight meant entering a conflict with an opponent that had already bent the rules in its favor. What had started as a letter in the mailbox had now become a full-scale assault, and the outcome was still terrifyingly uncertain. Late at night, when the neighborhood was quiet and the glow of porch lights softened into the dark, the breakthrough came in the form of a misplaced box. It was buried deep in a storage room of the community office, left carelessly among outdated pamphlets and forgotten stacks of newsletters. Inside were records that were never meant to be found, copies of invoices, receipts, and tallies of board votes. At first glance, the papers seemed routine, the kind of dry documentation that made up the machinery of any association. But the longer the pages were examined, the clearer the pattern became. These were not legitimate expenses. They were a carefully woven fabric of lies. There were receipts for landscaping work supposedly performed by companies that did not exist. Invoices listed road repairs that had never been carried out, even though the streets of the neighborhood still bore cracks and potholes. Payments had been authorized for maintenance on playgrounds and facilities that had never been built. The numbers were not just padded, they were completely fabricated, conjured out of thin air, and then divided into special assessments charged to homeowners. The illusion was seamless on the surface, but once the box was opened, the fraud was undeniable. The most chilling detail was that these documents traced back to the same small circle of people. The board members who had signed off on the charges were the ones who benefited most from them. Their signatures appeared at the bottom of every fake invoice, approving money for projects that never materialized. The $70,000 demand was no clerical accident. It was deliberate. The figure had been inflated to an absurd level not only to frighten, but to corner the homeowner into default. The plan was simple: crush with debt, seize the house, and acquire valuable property under the guise of unpaid dues. It was exploitation dressed as authority. As the truth came into focus, a deeper sense of unease set in. How long had this been happening? How many neighbors had already been pushed out under similar pretenses, their silence purchased by fear or by the loss of everything they owned? The neatly painted homes and manicured lawns were not signs of prosperity. They were evidence of compliance, proof that others had either fallen in line or disappeared quietly, leaving their properties behind. The perfect suburb was a mask that hid systematic abuse, engineered by those trusted to lead. The discovery shifted everything. What had once felt like a solitary battle was suddenly part of a larger pattern. The inflated bills, the vague, special assessments, the secret meetings, all of it was designed to maintain control and feed a scheme that thrived in the shadows. The board wasn't mismanaging funds or making mistakes. It was orchestrating fraud with precision. The $70,000 bill was not about enforcing rules, but about power and greed. It was a weapon, sharpened by years of practice, and aimed at anyone who dared question authority. The sense of betrayal deepened with every page turn. The very people entrusted to safeguard the neighborhood had turned it into their personal profit machine. The realization was bitter. Those who had waved at block parties, those who had introduced themselves with handshakes and smiles, had been using the cloak of trust to strip their neighbors of homes and wealth. The illusion of community had never been real. It was a stage set, carefully arranged to conceal what was happening just out of sight. As the night stretched on, the evidence piled higher until the weight of it filled the room. It was no longer a matter of opinion or rumor. It was documented, proof that the $70,000 demand was part of a fraudulent scheme. The box of records told a story far more sinister than any single letter ever could. It revealed intent, calculation, and a pattern of exploitation that had turned an ordinary suburban neighborhood into a hunting ground for those who held power. The silence of the streets outside felt heavier than ever, as though the whole neighborhood was complicit in keeping the truth buried. But now, the truth could not be unseen. The battle was no longer about one home, but about exposing the system that had allowed this corruption to thrive. The discovery was not just a crack in the foundation of the HOA, it was a fissure that threatened to bring the entire structure crashing down. Truth did not stay hidden for long. Once the documents surfaced, they began to circulate quietly through the neighborhood, shared first in whispers, then in secret meetings, and finally in broad daylight. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now gathered in driveways and on front lawns, piecing together their own experiences. Patterns began to emerge with startling clarity. Families who had abruptly moved out, houses that had gone up for sale without warning, and sudden vacancies that had seemed random were all connected. Each had been targeted in similar ways, pressured with inflated assessments and threats until surrender was the only option. The facade of peaceful suburbia was crumbling, replaced by the raw knowledge that their trust had been weaponized against them. As the evidence spread, the HOA board tried to maintain its grip. Letters kept arriving, each more aggressive than the last, as if sheer intimidation could cover the cracks in their scheme. But the once powerful language now read differently. In the light of what had been uncovered, what had once caused panic now looked like the desperate tactics of a system collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. For years, the board had operated in silence, counting on residents to stay isolated, fearful, and compliant. Now, the silence was broken, and with it, the illusion of control began to unravel. The media arrived next. Reporters appeared at the edges of the neighborhood with cameras and microphones, knocking on doors and gathering testimonies. Headlines began to circulate, exposing the scale of the fraud to a wider audience. The quiet streets, once notable only for their uniform houses and carefully trimmed hedges, suddenly became the backdrop of a scandal. Journalists documented how fake invoices had been used to funnel money away from the community and how fabricated debts were leveraged to seize homes. The story resonated beyond the neighborhood, striking a chord with anyone who had ever feared the unchecked power of an association that answered to no one. The board members who had once seemed untouchable now found themselves under scrutiny. Their signatures on fraudulent documents became evidence. Their decisions in secret meetings became points of investigation. What they had built over years of manipulation collapsed in a matter of weeks under the pressure of lawsuits, criminal charges, and public outrage. The same neighbors they had intimidated into silence were now standing against them, armed with proof and emboldened by solidarity. The fortress of authority they had relied on was reduced to rubble. For the homeowner who had received the $70,000 bill, the battle was both personal and symbolic. What began as a solitary struggle had grown into a fight that united an entire community. The lien that had once seemed like an unstoppable threat was lifted, not through quiet compliance, but through exposure of the truth. The house, which had felt on the brink of being stolen, remained standing, its walls still intact, despite the storm that had threatened to tear them down. It was not just the preservation of one property, but a victory against a system that thrived on fear. Yet even in victory, the scars remained. The neighborhood would never again feel as simple as it once had. The charm of tidy lawns and quiet streets was replaced with the knowledge of how fragile it all truly was. Trust had been shattered, and though the worst offenders were gone, the memory of their betrayal lingered. The experience had shown how easily power could be twisted, how quickly authority could become a weapon, and how deeply corruption could take root when hidden behind a friendly smile. In the end, the story was not just about one letter, one house, or one homeowner. It was about the exposure of a system that relied on silence, and the reminder that silence can be broken. What began as a single envelope in the mailbox became the spark that revealed an entire network of deception. The neighborhood that once prided itself on order and harmony had been shaken to its core. But in that destruction came clarity. The cost had been high, the fear overwhelming, but the outcome was undeniable. The $70,000 demand, meant to destroy one life, had instead brought down the very people who created it. The collapse of the board was more than an end. It was a warning that even in the most ordinary places, power left unchecked can become a danger far greater than anyone expects.